Hello and welcome back. My name is Rosie and this is Sinister, where we discuss the nitty-gritty details of the world's most notorious crimes, as well as some cases that not many people know about too, I suppose. So in today's episode, we are going back to the 1870s with the story of a woman named Julia Martha Thomas. So this was also known as the Barnes Mystery or the Richmond Murder around the time. And this was super big in the media, with over 500 news articles reported to have been written about this case at the time. And I do want to just give a trigger warning before we start. This case is quite a gory, gruesome case where some of the details might be a little bit sickening. We will discuss some dismembering of a body, and it does go a little bit beyond that, unfortunately. So if you do have a weak stomach or really don't want to hear about horrible things happening to a person posthumously, which I completely understand, I will give a trigger warning before I say the actual details. But if this episode isn't for you because of that, I completely understand, and we will have other episodes available with a lot less gore in them. For those still here, like I said, we are going back to the 1870s in Richmond, London. I do find the Victorian era extremely fascinating. However, documentation and things are obviously a bit difficult due to everything being on paper at the time. But regardless, let me tell you the story of Julia Martha Thomas. Julia was described as a small, well-dressed lady who would have been about 54 years old in 1879 when this story takes place. Julia was married twice, with both her husbands passing away, making her twice widowed. This would have been before she was even 50, which is absolutely horrifying. Now, after her second husband's death in 1873, she lived alone in her home at 2 Mayfield Cottages in Richmond. Julia was said to have an excitable temperament, and her neighbours described her as eccentric. She was known to frequently travel, leaving her friends and relatives unaware of her whereabouts for weeks or even months at a time. There is no mention of her ever having children, so I do get the impression that by this time she was kind of like that aunt without any responsibilities that just disappears and comes and goes as she pleases, traveling if she wants to, whatever else. Julia was classed as lower middle class, but known to dress up well and wear jewellery to give off the impression of wealth. She even employed a live-in domestic worker, so in all documentation it does say servant or something along those lines. Due to the time, I do not love that term, so I will use like domestic worker because she had them doing the cooking, cleaning, helping her dress, so it's just a branch term I'm going to be using throughout this case instead of servant. So this domestic worker would help her maintain her home. However, she did have a reputation for being a harsh employer who struggled finding and keeping staff. On the 29th of January 1879, Julia employed a woman named Kate Webster to be her new live-in maid or domestic worker. Now, Kate Webster had been born Catherine Lawler in Culzean, County Wexford, which is here in Ireland, sometime in 1849. Kate was described in the Daily Telegraph as a tall, strongly made woman of about 5 feet 5 inches or 165 centimetres in height, with sallow and much freckled complexion and large prominent teeth. I did have to look up the meaning of the word sallow, and apparently it means like unhealthy in appearance, often yellow in colour. I think I would bawl my eyes out if someone described me as any of those things. Saying large prominent teeth, I just think sounds very scary. The whole description sounds a bit witch-like. I would not be happy with that description at all. Details of Kate's early life seem to be undocumented, with later statements Kate made being proven to be unreliable. However, she claimed to have been married to a sea captain with the last name Webster, who she had 4 children with. Kate also claimed that all 4 of those children and her husband died within a short time of each other. We will see Kate garner a reputation of not being a reliable source, but this would kind of indicate that she had a lot of children in a really short period of time. She would have been under 15 for all of them, being extremely young. Obviously, it was a different time, but that is still very young. And then everyone dying, so that's 5 people so close to her dying. It does seem very far-fetched. I do know it's a time where a common cold could really cause a lot of damage. However, this seems to be quite unrealistic regardless of the time, and it's just never proven to be true regardless. So in December 1864, Kate was first imprisoned for theft when she was just 15 years old. After getting out, she stole money to pay for the ferry fare to get from Ireland to England. And by February 1868, she was sentenced to what they called penal servitude for 4 years after committing theft again. Penal servitude does seem to be like a type of hard labour forced upon prisoners instead of them just kind of existing in a prison cell. But here she was imprisoned until 1872. By 1873, Kate had moved into a place called Rose Gardens in Hammersmith, West London, where she became friends with a neighbouring family by the names of Henry and Anne Porter, who will return later on in the story. But Kate will not have contact with these people for quite a few years after moving. So after she did move from that home, on the 18th of April in 1874, Kate gave birth to a son she named John W. Webster, the father of whom was never properly identified, as she named 3 different men at different times. One of the men that she did name was a man with the last name Strong, who she was living with, and she claimed that she was forced into crimes as she had been, quote, forsaken by him and committed crimes for the purpose of supporting myself and my child. This man, Strong, did abandon Kate and the son once John was born. But if he was the father, I do find it strange that she would give her child the supposed sea captain's last name, especially given the time when it probably would have been a bit of a crime to be an unwed mother and things like that. That seems strange to me. Who knows? Kate regularly moved around West London using various aliases, including Webb, Webster, Shannon, Gibbs, Gibbons, Lawler, and Lawless, which is a severely suspicious amount of aliases. But what Kate needed all of these aliases for was a scheme she had thought up for robbing boarding houses. So Kate's scheme that she regularly played out was to get a room for a night at a boarding house, sell everything in the room that she could throughout the night, and then she would disappear in the morning before the owners would come expecting payment for the room. However, she didn't really get away with any of this, and in May 1875, she was convicted of 36 charges of theft related to this scheme. Here, she was sentenced to 18 months in prison. However, Kate never really seemed to learn from any of the prison sentences, and very shortly after being released, she was arrested again and sentenced to another 12 months imprisonment in February 1877. Again, this would have been for theft, and it would have only been about 2 or 3 months after she was released from prison for the 18-month sentence. Plus, she has a child. She has John, so it's a lot going on. However, while Kate was imprisoned, her son John was cared for by a friend of Kate's named Sarah, so he was at least looked after. Once Kate was released from prison again, she found domestic work with a family called the Mitchells. So you might be thinking she's finally learned her lesson, she's going to get a proper job and do all that sort of stuff. No. That employment was extremely short-lived. As Kate explained, the Mitchells didn't have anything worth stealing, so she didn't really want to work. She just wanted to get whatever it was she could out of others. There was no actual indication to find employment and to work and these things. It was just who she could work for so that she could steal off them, really. That was end of story. Now, Kate's friend Sarah ended up falling ill, and Sarah worked as a part-time cleaner for a lady named Miss Lodder, who lived in Richmond. So while Sarah was too sick to work, it was arranged for Kate to temporarily take her place for Sarah working for Miss Lodder. Now, Miss Lodder must have found Kate a good worker in some aspects, since she did end up introducing Kate to one of her friends named Julia, recommending that Kate be Julia's new live-in domestic worker. Now, apparently Julia requested Kate's help immediately, never inquiring about her history or anything. Not that I'd say Kate would have been very honest about that regardless. However, perhaps it's something to ask about. But there and then, they decided that Kate would go and work for Julia, living in her home. It was very soon after being employed that the relationship between the two appeared to have started deteriorating. Julia lived quite close to a pub called the Hole in the Wall, where Kate was noted to spend more time drinking there than what she would working in Julia's home, as she was employed to do. And when Kate was actually completing her job, it was said that Julia disliked the quality of Kate's work and regularly criticised it. So, as I said, Julia was a bit of a harsh employer. She was known to be quite confrontational with her staff, especially when she wasn't happy with the work of her, like, quote-unquote servants. And Kate later stated when interviewed, "When I had finished my work in my rooms, she used to go over it again after me and point out places where she said I did not clean, showing evidence of a nasty spirit towards me." I do feel like Kate kind of plays the victim a little bit too much here. Like, she was employed to do a job regardless. However, Julia was known to be harsh. I do suppose in a sense, when you are employing someone to do a job for you and providing them accommodation on top of that, I do think you want them at the house working more so than being at the pub down the road. However, all of these things were making Kate more resentful towards Julia, putting a larger strain on the pair's relationship. And I also kind of get the impression that Kate may have been maybe aggressive or angry towards Julia because Julia ended up persuading friends to stay in her home with her because she no longer wanted to be alone with Kate. So obviously, Kate was showing signs of being some type of a threat towards Julia. And from there, Julia gave Kate notice to leave. Kate was given until the 28th of February to find a job and alternative accommodation, which was less than a month into her employment. She wasn't great at keeping a job either. Julia's last diary entry actually said, "Gave Catherine wanting to leave," which I find interesting to put in a diary, but there was no other mention of anything else being written about Kate. Not to say that there wasn't anything else written about Kate, just nothing else has been documented as being written about Kate. Now, the 28th came and Kate apparently hadn't found anywhere to go. So she somehow persuaded Julia to keep her on for a further 3 days, agreeing to leave after the Sunday, which would have been the 2nd of March. However, I believe the friends that Julia had gotten to stay with her left. They weren't going to stay longer since she'd kept Kate on by choice kind of thing, so they were done. So Kate continued working through the weekend, but on Sundays, Kate was only expected to work half days. So she went to the hole in the wall throughout the first half of the day, agreeing to return in time to help Julia prepare for evening service at church. However, Kate wasn't back in time, returning to the house later into the evening and quite drunk. This obviously made Julia late for church, which really upset her given their arrangement, and the two did get into an argument about this. But ultimately, Julia could still make it to the service and she left the house to attend church. Several members of the congregation reported Julia as being very agitated on her arrival, and Julia had actually told a few members that she had been delayed by the, quote, neglect of her servant to return home at the proper time, and that Kate had flown into a terrible passion upon being rebuked. So after the service was over, Julia returned to the house around 9 p.m, confronting Kate again while they were at the top of the stairs. This resulted in Kate, unfortunately, pushing Julia down the stairs. I was just editing and realised that a large chunk of footage is completely blurred, so I thought I would try again. So Kate's story at this time was that, quote, "Mrs. Thomas came in and went upstairs. I went up after her and we had an argument which ripened into a quarrel, and in the height of my anger and rage I threw her from the top of the stairs to the ground floor. She had a heavy fall and I became agitated at what had occurred, lost all control of myself, and to prevent her screaming and getting me into trouble, I caught her by the throat, and in the struggle she was choked and I threw her on the floor." That does sound like she's completely dismissing all type of responsibility for herself and refusing to take any type of, accountability for her own actions. She was choked in the struggle. Just seems like she's acting like miraculously. Somehow Julia ended up choked in the struggle as if she didn't do it firsthand herself and things like that. My rage was so much, I didn't want her getting me in trouble. She just will not take accountability for her own actions, and that's a lot. Now, Julia's landlady and mother only lived nearby, and they said they heard a thump like a chair falling over but paid no attention to it at the time, which I think is completely fair enough. How often do you hear loud noises from your neighbours? Especially, obviously Julia didn't have kids, but you hear people with kids and things like that, and you're gonna think nothing of it. Look, it most likely would have been Julia falling down the stairs. However, again, I don't think any blame can be pointed at anyone other than Kate for that. So Kate took no time in beginning to dispose of Julia's body, and this is where it gets quite disturbing. So if you don't want to hear these gory details, just skip ahead a couple of minutes. Kate dismembered Julia's body and boiled a lot of her on a pot and then put Julia's bones in a fire. Kate stated in her confession, quote, I determined to do away with the body as best I could. I chopped the head from the body with the assistance of a razor, which I used to cut through the flesh afterwards. I also used the meat saw and the carving knife to cut up the body. I prepared the copper with water to boil the body to prevent identity, and as soon as I had succeeded in cutting it up, I placed it in the copper and boiled it. I opened the stomach with the carving knife and burnt up as much of the parts as I could. Now, I know that is such a gruesome quote and it's very disgusting. And the way Kate speaks about it is just, she's way too blasé about the whole thing. It's really disturbing. But I think this is why this case did receive so much notoriety, for just like the way she acted and things like that. It's a lot and it's hectic, and it's definitely not for like, oh, like you have to have a bit of a strong stomach to deal with it. But no, that's that part. Now, the neighbours began noticing an unpleasant smell, with even Kate later saying she had become like overcome from both the horrible sight and smell. However, no one else noticed anything else off at 2 Mayfield cottages, and this went mostly unreported. Remembering too, Julia would go away for weeks and months at a time without informing anyone, so people not seeing her around wouldn't have been too concerning initially either. It's just really a sad situation. Now, over the following days, Kate continued cleaning the house and Julia's clothes to put on this show of normality. Meanwhile, Kate was packing the dismembered remains into a black bag and a corded wooden bonnet box. Kate was unable to fit Julia's head and one foot into the containers, so she disposed of these separately, throwing her foot into a rubbish heap, and Julia's head was actually buried under the hole in the walls stables, which was near Julia's house. So it's all quite horrific. On the 4th of March, Kate travelled to the Porter's home, if you remember her old neighbours, where she was wearing Julia's silk dress and carrying the bag containing the dismembered Julia. Here she introduced herself as Mrs. Thomas and claimed that since last seeing them, which was 6 years prior, she had married, had a child, been widowed, and had been left a house in Richmond by an aunt. She invited the father, Henry Porter, and his son Robert to a pub in Barnes, and while the men were drinking, Kate excused herself just to dispose of this black bag. It was most likely dropped into the River Thames, but this bag has never since been recovered, unfortunately. Now, while at the pub, Kate asked if they could get her in touch with someone that would purchase the house and belongings, and they agreed to introduce her to a man named John Church in the following days. Kate also asked Robert if he could help her carry a heavy box from Julia's home to the station under the guise that this was her home, and this was actually the corded wooden bonnet box with Julia inside. Now, while they crossed the Richmond Bridge, Kate told Robert to leave it and she'd catch up to him. Kate then must have pushed the box into the Thames. Robert said he heard a large splash, and then Kate caught up with him saying, well, that's over. And this didn't arouse Robert's suspicions, so I guess he was just doing someone a favour. Why would he care if it went into the river? But it was only the next day that the box washed up in shallow water, where a man also named Henry was driving past sometime before 7 a.m, and he spotted it. He opened it and horrifically found the partial remains of Julia. An examiner determined that it was the trunk without the organs and the legs missing 1 foot of a woman. Around the same time, the foot from the rubbish where she'd thrown 1 foot into a rubbish heap, that was found, and eventually it did take time, but eventually they connected all the remains to be from the same person. However, this was the 1870s, so determining who this was not an easy feat. Definitely not as easy as it would have been today. Now, the doctor actually believed these were the remains of a young person with very dark hair, while Julia was 54. The cause of death couldn't be found, although there were speculations that the body had been used for dissection and anatomical study due to the fact that Kate had kind of dismembered it so thoroughly. Media dubbed this as the Barnes Mystery, and they buried Julia's body in a cemetery on the 19th of March while she was still unidentified. Now, the owner of a pub claimed that Kate was trying to sell the best dripping there, and there was talk of Kate having offered pots of lard to neighbours and children. This was thought to be the boiled remains of Julia being sold as dripping and lard. However, it is unsure if any of this, if like this could be an old wives' tale. This might have never happened. There is no actual evidence of this occurring, and it didn't seem like this was addressed in Kate's trial in any capacity. Now, as I said, Julia was known to disappear for weeks and months at a time without letting anyone know she had left, so there was little suspicion about her not being there. And Kate continued living in Julia's home at 2 Mayfield Cottages and began actually posing as Julia, wearing her clothing and dealing with tradesmen, which I'm not sure how she would have gotten away with in a community where there was neighbours that knew Julia and things like that, but she did for a little while. On the 9th of March, while still posing as Julia, Kate reached an agreement with John Church, as Henry Porter had organised, to sell Julia's furniture and goods to furnish John's pub. On the 18th of March, John came to the house with a removal horse and cart, and this was when neighbours became suspicious as they hadn't seen Julia in nearly 2 weeks. Julia's landlady asked the delivery man who had ordered the goods removed, and he replied that it was Mrs. Thomas, but indicated towards Kate. Realising she had been exposed, Kate fled immediately, with her son returning to her home in Ireland. Police searched Julia's home, discovering bloodstains, burnt finger bones in the fire, and fatty deposits where Kate had boiled Julia's body, as well as a letter left by Kate giving her home address in Ireland. So it was extremely clear to police immediately what had happened. So wanted notices went out with a description of Kate and her son, who unfortunately got dragged into this, and the head constable of the Royal Irish Constabulary in Wexford, Ireland, noticed the woman from years earlier when she had been arrested for theft. They were able to trace Kate to her uncle's farm in Killane, where she was wearing Julia's clothes and jewellery. Here they arrested her on the 29th of March. She was returned to Richmond to face the charges, and sadly, after hearing about the crimes Kate had committed, the uncle actually refused to house Kate's son, and authorities sent him to what was known as a workhouse, which kind of seems to be like a type of institution where you're given accommodation, but you're employed through serious labour in order to live there. And it's also not a choice. It's forced upon you as well. But I think that's so sad that like a child he would have been maybe 16 or so, but I think it's so sad that a child was brought into this. It's so horrific. It's not his fault, who his mother is. So this case actually caused such an immediate uproar throughout both Ireland and England that apparently while transporting Kate between Wexford and Dublin, crowds gathered to gawk and jeer at her at stations in between, like they were horrified at the act she had done. And rich people attended the pre-trial hearings, with Kate's first appearance at the Richmond court garnering an immense crowd. On the 2nd of July, 1879, Kate's trial began, and the trial apparently was just as popular for onlookers to attend. I believe it was more so how gruesome the disposing of the body was, and probably the fact that it was a female murderer in the 1870s that made this so popular. It's a time where women aren't capable of things like this, and it's like as far as society thinks. So I think it did garner such an immense crowd because of that. So people from all social backgrounds attended, with even the Crown Prince of Sweden having attended the 4th day of the trial. The trial lasted 6 days, and Kate attested that Julia had been murdered, but not by her, as she accused John Church of murdering Julia in an attempt to rob her belongings and sell them, to make enough money to leave his wife and elope with Kate. Because Kate's so appealing, everyone would want to murder for her. John did have a strong alibi for the evening, so Kate shifted the blame to Henry Porter, as he had also attempted to purchase some of Julia's belongings, which was obviously only due to the stories that Kate had told him. Henry also had an alibi and was cleared of any involvement, and Kate's shifting testimony resulted in her being described as an inveterate liar, which is like a habitual liar. Kate pleaded not guilty and referenced her devotion to her son as a reason she couldn't have been capable of murder, which obviously we know is not a reason. However, due to the strong dislike of Kate by the entire nation, nothing seemed like it would be in Kate's favour with this trial. It also sounds like she's trying to feed into the notion of women being the fairer sex and only capable of being mothers, and murder is for men, things like that, which we know not to be true, but it was just, she was going to say and do anything to try and get away with this. Now, a woman named Mary Durden testified in court that Kate had visited her on the 25th of February, which would have been 5 days before the murder, and told her of a property in Birmingham that she had inherited from an aunt, so she was going to sell property, jewellery, and the house. The possessions described by Kate matched the possessions of Julia's sold after her death, indicating premeditated murder. Now, if you remember, before she was given until the 28th and then requested 3 more days, this was obviously already knowing that she was going to kill Julia, and she was practically bragging about it without explicitly saying that that's what's going to happen. So it only took about an hour for the jury to find Kate guilty, and the judge sentenced her to death by hanging. The judge asked Kate if there was any reason she shouldn't be sentenced to death, and Kate told the judge that she was pregnant. Now, as I said, she's known to tell some porkies. A jury of matrons, which is 12 women, was selected to determine if Kate was with child. So 12 women and a surgeon attend a private room with Kate to determine if she's with child. I don't know what they do there. I'm not sure. I think it's like a little investigation, look inside type of thing. That seems absolutely violating. I know Kate's not a good person, but that just seems like an absolute violation to me. Anyway, it only took minutes for them all to return with the verdict that she was not pregnant. This obviously could not be possibly a foolproof method, but regardless, I don't think she would have been pregnant anyway. She's just a liar. And Kate was sentenced to be executed. Now, appeals were submitted on Kate's behalf, but all turned down due to insufficient grounds. Before her execution, Kate made statements confessing to the crime. In her first one, she implicated Strong, the possible father of her child, who she said led her to a life of crime. Now, there was no evidence to support any of this, and the night before her execution, Kate did actually recant that statement, and she took full responsibility, exonerating John Church, Henry Porter, and Strong of any involvement. But everything was still left a mystery for the public due to Kate being seen as such a liar. So Kate was not ever visited by family or friends while imprisoned, but Kate Webster was hanged on the 29th of July at 9 a.m. with a newly developed long drop technique causing instantaneous death. She was the only woman to be hanged at this prison. A crowd outside waited. They cheered as the black flag was raised over the prison walls, indicating that the death sentence had been carried out, and Kate was then buried in an unmarked grave in the prison's exercise yard. So John Church ended up getting Julia's furniture after Kate's death, and he also got numerous personal items, including the knife she was dismembered with, which just seems a bit odd to me, but anyway. Other items related to the case were sold off to interested members of society, and others took small pebbles and twigs from the property as souvenirs. Again, an odd thing for me to take souvenirs from. Like, clearly I have a fascination in true crime, but I just think it's quite sick in a sense for someone to want. I understand, look, people have varying degrees of fascination. To want the knife that took someone's life and like dismembered a human just seems really hectic to me, actually. But it was a different time too. So it was also prior to trial that Madame Tussauds had created a wax figure of Kate Webster, putting her on display as the Richmond murderess for anyone wanting to see what she looked like. This is also another kind of odd, morbid curiosity, but this is one I do understand. If this was still around, I would want to go and see a wax figure, especially given her description in, like, what was it, the Daily Telegraph. I think I would be very fascinated to like see her in person and see what they were kind of describing, because every image is just a drawing. You don't know what she actually looked like. So that would be fascinating to me. But this remained there well into the 20th century in the Chamber of Horrors. And 2 Mayfield cottages remained unoccupied until 1897, as no one wanted to live there after the murder, and kind of people knew that they wouldn't be able to find people to work in there as well because it's such a notorious place. There was supposed to be 597 separate news articles about this case at the time. And as I said, so Kate had buried Julia's head in the Hole of the Wall stables. But for many years, the head of Julia was speculated to have been thrown into the Thames separately to the box and had just not been found. However, in October 2010, a skull was discovered during excavations of the backyard of none other than Sir David Attenborough. So he had been doing work on his home and he actually found a skull in his backyard. After forensic examination, it was concluded in July 2011 that they were the remains of Julia Martha Thomas. And this finally allowed a final cause of death to be classed as asphyxia by strangulation and head injury, which was 131 years later. I do think it's a bit hectic for it to be 131 years later. Anyone close to her would never have actually found the cause of death, and that can be quite horrific for people. But it's nice that there was finally an actual answer. And yeah. But that is everything I know about the story of Julia Martha Thomas and Kate Webster. It is such a horrific thing for the case for the time, but everyone knows now that women are capable of just as much as men and things like that. So I guess it's like a little bit less disturbing now in a sense, because it's like it's something we know, whereas back then it's like a woman capable of this doesn't seem right, rah rah rah. But no, that is everything. That's the story, and I hope you enjoyed. And hopefully next week I am back with Paul, and we will see you next week. Bye!